Interpreters have played a pivotal role during the pandemic, connecting multicultural communities and helping media outlets make contact with international stories. But as the pandemic levels out, and with vaccinations and the like, what does the future hold for the industry of interpretation? Ticker Talk starts right now. Hello and welcome to Ticker Talks, and together with Polaron Language Services we are looking to use language to connect communities. And of course, whilst Polaron is the sponsor of today's program, all the views and opinions in the following segment are of course our own. And I would like to acknowledge that this segment is being held on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and I pay my respects to elders both past, present and future as well. And I am joined by my special guest and co-host of the show, Director of Polaron Language Services, Eva Hussein. Good to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all. Now, what's been going on at Polaron this week? You guys are always working on something very exciting.
We are and we do. So today we're going to be showcasing a project which is to do with health. So a project that we did into 5 different languages, including, it included multimedia resources, so videos and information that's visual. Yeah. So there's more and more of that happening in the translation space where, information's chunked and kind of limited to what we need to know. There's fewer projects where we translate text, so we have moved on to this space where everybody wants less information but in a more targeted way.
Yeah, and delivering it with those animations is always a very clever way to go about it.
Very engaging.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's touch on miscommunication of the week. Each week Eva brings me something that she's seen out in the wild that hasn't been translated so well. What have you seen at the moment?
So this one goes back about 10 years ago, okay. or maybe even a bit more, Mike. So I wanted to showcase that particular one because it's so interesting, and it emphasizes the importance of briefing interpreters. So what it was an interview on SBS by George Negus with Muammar Gaddafi, who's no longer alive, of course, and a feared dictator.
I remember,
right? You remember?
Yes.
I remember watching that and feeling mortified about what happened, because at some point towards the end of the interview, George asked Muammar Gaddafi about what he would like to be written on his tombstone.
Oh.
And the interpreter just wouldn't interpret that because it's not something that was culturally sensitive. So what he did say is, what would you like to be known by in many years to come? He kind of tried to wrap it up into something a bit more palatable. And Gaddafi, of course, spoke English, and he said, that is not what he said. That's not what he asked me. And the interpreter, we didn't see his face, but you could hear fear in his voice, and he said, no, that's kind of what he said. So the lesson out of that, had the interpreter been briefed by SBS, he would have probably told them, you need to rephrase that question a little, because it was just culturally not sensitive.
Insensitive, yeah, and that's where you get into trouble, and that's,
So therefore, briefing of interpreters, very important.
Well, that leads us into our discussion for today. And of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, interpreters have been an essential component to communication, helping with the smooth running of operations in many industries, from court hearings and medical appointments to government conferences, assisted learning and health messaging, which is a really important one, obviously. The industry has also seen an increase in remote interpreting and the changes to the way they work. So how has the interpreting industry adapted to these changes, and what does the future hold? Well, let's bring in our guests for today, and we've got Dr Ester Leung, an Associate Professor of Translation Studies at Melbourne University. She is also practicing to be an interpreter and translator with particular interest in legal and medical interpreting. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
And we also have Michael. No worries at all. And we've also got Michael Nemarich, who is the Managing National Operations at the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters, also known as NAATI. Welcome to you.
Hi, good to be here.
Now, Esther, I'll start with you. What are some of the changes that you've seen in the interpreting industry over the past couple of years? It's clearly been quite a busy one. And how has COVID-19 impacted the interpreting industry from where you've sat?
Well, I think the changes have started long before the COVID-19, the increasingly more use of these remote interpreting services available to people, marginalized people because of geographical locations, of different reasons, economic reasons or whatever. So we have more and more use of these remote interpreting services available provided by interpreters who are not restricted by the locations or where they are. So it's opened up an entire market. This interpreters that I've known that they've been interpreting for the Chinese market in America or in Australia. So there's this different world almost, I think, for the interpreters working in this century, working in this COVID era especially.
Has it been a positive change just during that period that you noticed, that slow change that you mentioned?
I think, well, I don't think this is a slow change. It's quite dramatic, as I think, because of the technology and this artificial intelligence and the application of big data in whatever industry, not just translation interpreting. I think in the business sectors as well, that we've seen all these impacts of this artificial intelligence, big data that are used in the industry. And in translation and interpreting, this is no exception.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. And I'll go to you now, Michael. Since 2018, you've been leading NAATI's operations, where you've been instrumental, I should say, in the implementation of a new certification system. What significant changes have you noticed in the interpreting sector in the last 3 years?
Well, very much along those same lines. Clearly, you can't get away from the move to online and acceptance of it. For us, as a company, it's affected us. So 2/3 of our tests are done online for interpreters in the last 6 months, with Sydney and Melbourne in lockdown. But I think there's been some real positives in that. One of the real positives is that general worldwide acceptance of video as a good format and a sort of base level understanding of how it works, which has made it more accessible and more usable than it was in the past. Everyone sort of understood that online was a good forum in the past, but there was always compatibility issues. Now with Zoom and Teams so prominent across the world, there's always sort of a default program that can be used and people have a base level understanding of how it works. So that's been a really huge positive development. And I think we've also seen, due to COVID, that greater acceptance of interpreters and translators and the important role that they're playing in society. You can't go past a key politician's speech now or emergency services speech, going back to the bushfires prior to COVID, without an Auslan interpreter standing alongside the chief minister or the minister of the day. And I think that's been a really positive thing for the industry of highlighting how important these things are. And conversely, we've seen some really poor translations impact, particularly in Melbourne and the like, with key critical health messages being done via a basic freeware translation tool and leading to poor outcomes because of that.
Esther, I'll go back to you. And as a practitioner and professor, what advice can you give to people who might be considering becoming a professional interpreter? We understand it's a popular industry, it's growing.
Yeah, I think so. Language is the basic thing. If we talk about language competence these days, this is not just about the level of language competencies. We're talking about this context competence in the different kind of professional settings as well. So cultural context is one thing, and then this professional context is another thing. Whether the interpreters and translators are confident in the area of their translation and interpreting, I think this is a very important area too. So in a way, I think interpreters and translators can consider focusing, specializing in particular area as their career develop. Rather than just doing something very general and very broad, and they might want to focus in a particular area to develop that into their expertise area instead. And the other thing I think for interpreters especially, humility is very important. Interpreters has to be aware of, I think, the fact that interpreting itself is a very humbling experience. So that more that you interpret, the more you know that you don't know about the other people's area and specializations. So having that in mind, that you would be more open and be to learn about new things and do your research before you do your interpreting. I think that is a very important attitude and I think this is the DNA of interpreters that you need to have to become professional, better interpreters in the long run.
Michael, I'll go over to you, and I know we don't have a crystal ball per se. If the last 2 years have shown us that, we don't know what could be next. But can you give us a little bit of insight into what you think the future might hold for this industry and for all the people that have listened to Dr. Ester and basically said, I want to do interpreting, and when they're stepping into the role, what's the future got in hold for it?
I think, to follow on a couple of those points, I think that specialisation is going to really become very important. NAATI certification is about generalisation, but I think with the introduction of more AI, more machine translations, that ability to apply in a specialised context, like you'll be able to, there's always going to be a need for humans in the process, there's always going to be a need for a quality assurance program to ensure that you've got a base level understanding of what the person bringing has got.
Certainly getting faster and faster. I'd like to thank you both for your time today. That's all we've got time for on the program, but thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you for having us here.
So just give us a little summary just before we head off.
Mike, the future is bright. The future is full of humans, supported by machines, so we're not obsolete as yet. But I think some of the things that Michael and Esther have said are really important to keep in mind.
Yes.
The one message I wanted to send to everybody, you're only as good as your interpreter. So you can prepare all you like, but if your interpreter is good, that's the only time that you'll sound good in the language that they interpret in. So briefing, preparation, using technology to assist is really, really important in this conversation. But at the end of the day, it's still the skill of interpreters and that humility. I love that, what Esther said.
Yeah.
And preparation is really, really key. Anyone that's not worked with an interpreter, once you do, you'll know the difference between a good interpreter and someone that's not prepared or not briefed or not ready.
It's definitely something I've learnt by hosting this program. But guys, thank you so much for joining us. And of course, if you have any questions about how to reach your multicultural audiences, get in touch with the team over at Polaron. The contact details are there on the screen. And I'd like to thank you once again for joining me on the program. Eva, thank you to you.
Thank you.
And we will see you again soon. I'm Mike Loader. All the best.